Welcome to these video notes where we'll be talking about the gas exchange systems and the specifics of how your body is moving oxygen and carbon dioxide between your circulatory system and your respiratory system and how it's all being regulated. Okay. So these are the main learning objectives. As we go through this, I'll point out some specific things that you're going to need to make sure you're focusing on. We're definitely going to have to talk about what we call oxygen dissociation curves. You're going to have to be able to understand how to use an oxygen dissociation curve. We talk about things like hemoglobin. We're going to talk about myoglobin and fetal hemoglobin as well. We're going to talk about carbon dioxide and hydrocarbonate ions and how those are involved in the transferring of carbon dioxide around your blood. We'll also talk about the Bohr Effect and how pH is going to be an influencing of how well carbon dioxide moves around through the blood, and carbon and oxygen as well can move around in the blood. We'll talk about Chemo Receptors and how we're going to regulate our blood pH, the medulla oblongata's role in all of that. We'll talk about why ventilation changes when you're doing exercise. Here's our fetal hemoglobin as well. We'll talk about altitude and how concentration of gases at different altitudes can affect gas exchange. We'll talk about the specific pHs of blood. And then the last parts of it, we'll be talking about emphysema, cancer, and asthma, and other type of respiratory illnesses that can occur. And then this last part here, the last few slides, we'll be talking about how to identify pneumocytes, sorry, I can't say that word right now. Pneumocytes, these ones, your lung cells basically, and how you identify the different parts in your lung tissue. Okay, so let's go through this. This first bit is just a video that kind of goes along with talking about affinity for hemoglobin and oxygen and the general idea of a dissociation curve. A link for this video and some other videos that are useful from YouTube, they're going to be on ManageBack as well. So you could also watch those in addition to following along with these notes. So when we talk about hemoglobin and fetal hemoglobin and myoglobin, which are the main types of globins that we need to learn about for oxygen transport around the body during different times, different situations, all three of them are going to be mapping out how they handle oxygen and how they can bind to oxygen and release oxygen with what we call oxygen dissociation curve. And so this here is an oxygen dissociation curve. And if you look at it, basically what we have on the x-axis here are the partial pressure of oxygen in kPa, and the other side, the y-axis, is going to be the saturation of hemoglobin. And if you look at the data, you can see that as we increase partial pressure of oxygen, basically as we increase the concentration of oxygen in the area around hemoglobin, hemoglobin can become more and more saturated. So that basically means more oxygen is going to be able to bind to the hemoglobin that is present. So basically at sea level, at sea level, about 100 millimeters of mercury, which is a relatively high pressure of oxygen when you breathe in, your hemoglobin would be saturated about 98%. So, and that's really what your lungs are producing. So when you breathe in, you're creating a partial pressure level of about this much. Or if we're going to say, not 100 millimeters of mercury, equivalently it would be about 14 kPa. kPa and millimeters of mercury, they're different ways of measuring pressure. Mostly we talk about kPa, but sometimes you'll see millimeters of mercury show up. Anyway, so we're having our maximum levels of kPa that we'd be dealing with in terms of saturation in your lung tissue. And that makes a lot of sense because then that's really what your lungs are doing. The goal of your lungs is basically to force as much oxygen into contact with the hemoglobin as possible so that the hemoglobin can become saturated with this oxygen. As the blood moves through the tissue, moves through your body, the oxygen will start dissociating offwards. It'll start to lose its efficiency. And so as the pressure of oxygen, as the amount of oxygen decreases, we will see that the amounts of saturation of oxygen will decrease. And typically when we get to around our tissues, okay, we're anywhere from 40s to 60s in terms of our saturation points. And so we're starting to lose oxygen to the tissue. And this makes a lot of sense, given that that's what hemoglobin's role is to take oxygen, or oxygen from the lungs and move it to all of the tissues in the body. And so hemoglobin is basically reacting to the concentration of oxygen. So as more and more oxygen leaves the blood, it actually gets easier for more oxygen to dissociate from the hemoglobin and then get to other parts of the body that need oxygen for activity. So you know hemoglobin is going to carry oxygen molecules. You should remember that it's basically 4 oxygen molecules because they have 4 heme groups. Each hemoglobin is made up of 4 parts, and each one of those parts has a heme group, and each one of those heme groups can hold onto an oxygen, an O2. So we have these 4 heme groups, right? And we have 4 oxygen molecules. And so relatively at first it can be kind of difficult for hemoglobin and oxygen to attach or detach from hemoglobin. So as the first molecule of hemoglobin, the first O2 attaches to hemoglobin, it actually causes a small, tiny change in the shape of hemoglobin. So hemoglobin actually has a better chance of picking up oxygen the more oxygen that actually starts sticking to it. So at lower pressures, maybe we have a single hemoglobin binds with a single oxygen. With the oxygen here, they're showing you in yellow. And so then as we increase the amount of oxygen around the hemoglobin, there's a greater chance that we end up getting a second oxygen bound to another one of those heme groups in hemoglobin. But because of these presence of the oxygen attached to hemoglobin, the protein's shape itself actually changes just a little bit. And so we actually increase the probability of a third one attaching and increasing it to a fourth one attaching. So the more oxygen you have in an area, or the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, plus the higher probability of oxygen binding to an individual hemoglobin, we start to increase the probability that we saturate the hemoglobin naturally. And this is great because then we're not expelling a lot of energy to try to get oxygen to stick to hemoglobin. This will just be a natural passive process. So our bodies or the cells don't have to do anything in order to try to make oxygen stick to hemoglobin as much as possible. It's just if you breathe in and you keep that oxygen in your tissue, inside your lung tissue, you naturally will have oxygen start to bind to the hemoglobin because of the partial pressure that they exert. So the higher the partial pressure, basically it means the easier it is for oxygen to stick to hemoglobin. And then the reverse of that will be true. As we lower the partial pressure of oxygen, it will be easier for oxygen to leave hemoglobin or detach from hemoglobin. Okay? So this affinity that oxygen has, this is oxygen's affinity, hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen is basically its ability to bind to it. Okay? And so we'll have a shift in affinity depending on the hemoglobin is binding more or less to oxygen. And we can have a shift in affinity based on pH, which is what the Bohr effect is going to do. We can have a shift in affinity, I can't speak today, a shift in affinity if we're talking about a different type of hemoglobin. For example, regular hemoglobin is what we're showing you here, versus fetal hemoglobin, which is the hemoglobin that would be present inside a fetus that has not been born yet, or myosin, which would be the myoglobin, which is present in muscle cells. So we'll talk about each one of those and how their oxygen affinity is slightly different. Okay, sorry, I'm going to try to slow down. I feel like I'm talking too fast. All right, so that's our regular hemoglobin that we just showed you with that dissociation curve. So now we're looking at fetal hemoglobin. And so fetal hemoglobin, if you remember that, we haven't really talked about it in general, but fetus in general, yes, you know that it's an unborn child, and that the fetus is going to have to get oxygen and nutrition from the placenta, which is going to have it connect to the mother's circulatory system. And so fetal hemoglobin can't have the same affinity levels as regular human hemoglobin, because if you think about it, the mother is breathing in, and so the oxygen goes into her hemoglobin, and then as the hemoglobin is passing all around through her body, it's losing more and more oxygen to her tissue, and eventually when it gets down to the baby and passes through to the placenta, there would be very, very little oxygen left compared to the oxygen levels that were present in the lungs. And so normal human hemoglobin, if that's what the fetus had, it wouldn't really be able to get a lot of oxygen, and it wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen to survive and to adapt and develop. So fetal hemoglobin, which we only really have when we are developing and eventually gets turned off and no longer used after we're born, fetal hemoglobin basically has a much higher affinity. So if you look at the table here, in black we're talking about regular adult hemoglobin, and in the red we're looking at the fetal hemoglobin. And if you look at a specific point, for example, let's say we wanted to do 50% saturation, right? So 50% saturation about this line. For a fetus hemoglobin, we would only need, it's kind of hard for me to draw on the screen, maybe less than 20 kilopascals of O2. However, for an adult, it would have to be above 20, maybe like 30 kilopascals. So that means that at a lower saturation of oxygen, or a lower partial pressure, we can still get at least 50% of the hemoglobin to be saturated with oxygen. So since fetal hemoglobin has a much higher affinity curve here, being shifted to the left means it has a higher affinity curve. That means when the whatever oxygen is left over, when it makes it down towards the placenta, the fetal hemoglobin can actually really easily steal it from the mother's hemoglobin by being able to bind to any oxygen that's being released by the mother's hemoglobin, and it will hold on to it really easily. So then it can travel through the placenta into the umbilical cord here, and then once it gets into the umbilical cord, it will then travel through the baby's circulatory system, doing its own job of delivering oxygen to all those tissues. So if we look at our oxygen dissociation curve for fetal hemoglobin, it has been shifted to the left. That means it has a higher affinity by being moved towards the left. If we move towards the right, we have a lower affinity, and that is important later when we talk about the Bohr effect. You'll see both left and right shifting things on the graph. Okay, so this means that fetal hemoglobin is basically able to take up more oxygen at a lower partial pressure than adult hemoglobin. That means that the fetus can attain oxygen through the placenta from the mother's hemoglobin molecules that are being released to the blood system, where the placenta allows the mother's circulatory system and the fetus's circulatory system to kind of get really close to each other, so that the oxygen can move from her circulatory system to the baby's circulatory system and go from her hemoglobin to the baby's hemoglobin. Okay, so that was our hemoglobins, the regular adult hemoglobin versus the fetal hemoglobin. And the last globin that you need to know about would be the myoglobin. And so myoglobin is present in your muscle cells, and it's basically there to help store a little bit of extra oxygen to make sure that when you're doing various types of muscle contractions, when you just start a certain amount of exercise, you have that oxygen present in order to use it in aerobic respiration to release large amounts of ATP so that you can keep that energy going. It's estimated you have about 2 minutes worth of hard exercise for oxygen in your muscles, in your myoglobin. After about 2 minutes of sprinting or doing some really heavy lifting or something like that, 2 minutes of really tough work, that's when you're going to start to feel that you need to start increasing your breathing or your respiratory rate, because you don't have enough oxygen being delivered to parts of your body, and your oxygen supply is starting to decrease. You guys might be familiar with this feeling if you've ever climbed a good number of stairs, right, in a building. If you climb, 3 or 4 stairs or flights of stairs, you're probably doing okay. Once you get to 6, 7, 8, you're getting kind of tired. You're going to start breathing heavily a little bit, a lot more than your regular breathing rate would be. So your breathing rate will start to go up because you burned through all of that oxygen that was being stored in your myoglobin, and now you're depending completely on your hemoglobin to deliver oxygen to your muscles. And so myoglobin is just there to kind of prevent us from getting tired so quickly if we're not going to have to do intense exercise for a very long period of time. And so myoglobin has a very high efficiency for oxygen, and that's important because it's going to stay in your muscle cells regardless of whatever activity you're doing, whether you're being intense physical activity or you're sleeping. The myoglobin always wants to be supersaturated. So myoglobin, you can see, has been shifted even further than when we're looking at our fetal hemoglobin, right? It's very far shifted to the left. So if we looked at 50%, myoglobin could be 50% saturated as low as 3 partial pressures of oxygen, right? For a human being at 50%, here we're getting 25 to 30 partial pressures of oxygen, right? So being super, super efficient at binding oxygen, it doesn't lose that oxygen very easily to the environment as your oxygen levels fluctuate from doing certain amounts of just walking around and regular breathing, regular amounts of being alive. It's when you start doing a whole bunch of physical activity like sprinting or climbing a bunch of stairs that you are not used to climbing, stuff like that. That's what triggers that drop in oxygen from doing all that activity. That's what triggers your myoglobin to start releasing the oxygen to your mitochondria, so that the mitochondria can start doing respiration and keep your ATP levels up. So it's really efficient, and then it doesn't lose. There you go. It doesn't lose the oxygen very easily as pH and things change in your body. Okay, so myoglobin basically will release a lot of oxygen for a very, very narrow, low partial pressure range, and that's really just coming from when you do a lot of intense exercise at the very, very beginning. So if we look at the myoglobin here, since it has a much higher affinity for oxygen at very low partial pressures of oxygen, then when the blood reaches the muscle tissue, oxygen really quickly dissociates from the hemoglobin and then will bind to the myoglobin, and there it will be stored. And once we have the maximum amount of myoglobin saturated with hemoglobin, we won't really be losing any oxygen to those muscle cells as we're doing regular amounts of activity. It's already been saturated with it. So when we do a bunch of intense physical activity and we do lose that myoglobin again, one of the reasons why we're going to continue to keep breathing heavily even after we stop doing exercise is we need to make sure we have enough energy or ATP to keep our cells functioning. So we do need to keep oxygen levels in the cells doing cellular respiration. They need the oxygen present, but we also have to replace all of the oxygen we just spent in the myoglobin. So the myoglobins are going to start stealing all that oxygen as the blood passes through the muscle tissue. So that means less oxygen is going to be getting to other parts of the body. So once the myoglobin becomes saturated again, normally we will see a return to regular breathing rates because we've saturated ourselves with the oxygen that we need in the myoglobin. So myoglobin is very sensitive to changes in partial pressures of oxygen at lower levels. So let's say there's demand for oxygen starts. That's when you're going to start doing a bunch of really physical activity. Suddenly, there will be a really quick dissociation. So that means the myoglobin will release the oxygen very, very quickly so that it can be used by cells. So a flow of oxygenated blood will quickly replenish this depleted myoglobin in the muscle tissue to ensure that aerobic respiration will be able to continue. So again, even after you've finished doing your little sprint or you've done climbing those 6 or 7 flights of stairs, you're still going to feel a little winded because you have to replenish the myoglobin that you just burned in order to do that little burst of exercise. So in addition to understanding how oxygen is going to be moved around the body, so hemoglobin for the blood, myoglobin in the muscles, and then fetal hemoglobin if we're talking about a fetus, you also have to understand how carbon dioxide is being moved around the body. And though we will say, yes, you do need oxygen for cellular respiration, and when you burn through the oxygen that you have in your myoglobin, it needs to be replaced. Your rapid breathing isn't really caused necessarily by low levels of oxygen. It is that, but there's other factors as well. And one of the other factors that's probably even a stronger factor is actually the presence of carbon dioxide. So as you do cellular respiration, you know that carbon dioxide is going to be produced as a waste product. And carbon dioxide building up in your tissues creates a toxic environment because carbon dioxide can dissolve into water to create carboxylic acid, or basically something that could slightly modify the pH of your blood. And so your blood pH has to be in a very, very specific range, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on some other slides. And so in order to keep your blood pH in a very specific range, we need to get rid of that carbon dioxide. So we need to dissolve that carbon dioxide into the blood or transport it through our red blood cells. We have to, move it through the blood in some way to get it back to the lungs so that we can breathe it out and get it out as quick as possible. Because if our blood becomes too acidic, that's really dangerous for the rest of our other body parts, because you remember, pH can affect enzymes, it can affect protein structure. So if your blood becomes acidic, it is going to affect the some of the proteins that blood is connected to, and so that would be very dangerous for your body. So we have to know what are the different ways that carbon dioxide gets transported in the blood. So first off, it could be dissolved directly into the solution as carbon dioxide. So a very small percent can just go directly into the water, the plasma of that your blood has, and it just stays as carbon dioxide. It doesn't change anything. But this is only about 5%. It's a very small amount, can actually just stay in the blood plasma. The rest of it, the other 95%, we're going to have to deal with it in some other way. So we could also bind it to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, in addition to being able to carry oxygen, also has an affinity for carbon dioxide. So we could switch out the oxygen for the carbon dioxide and have the hemoglobin transfer the CO2 for us. And then the last thing is that we have hydrogen carbonate ions. So we could have some of the carbon dioxide dissolve into the blood plasma and dissolve but as a hydrogen carbonate ion, which will affect the pH a little bit, and that's the one we have to worry about. Okay, so when we look at this, here's our red blood cell, and imagine we have our respirating cells. Let me get some color here. Okay, so they're going to be releasing CO2. CO2 is going to, being a gas, it dissolves, diffuses straight through membranes. Okay, it just follows concentration gradient. So if it's a high concentration gradient here in the cells that are doing a bunch of activity, it would be a low concentration in the blood. So we would have a passive diffusion of the gas through both the interstitial fluid, the fluid around the tissue, and the walls of the capillary, and then here into the blood with the red blood cells. So it gets into the blood plasma, and then some of it will just naturally go into the blood plasma's cell cytoplasm, and there it will be dissolved. So it'll move around dissolved inside of the red blood cells fluid. That's part one. Part two is that it can be bound to hemoglobin. So we have our hemoglobin here, and so we have hemoglobin carrying a bunch of oxygen, a bunch of O2 for us. So remember, there are 4 oxygen atoms, or 4 oxygen molecules that are being held under our hemoglobin because there are 4 heme groups. And so as those 4 oxygen get released, hemoglobin can actually pick up some carbon dioxide, creating a carboxyhemoglobin group. And so we can have carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin, and so that's how it could also move through the body, being stuck to hemoglobin. And then our third one here is that carbon dioxide could create hydrocarbonate, mixing with water, basically. And so this could happen inside the cell, and then we don't want to necessarily lower the pH of the red blood cells too much. So we need to make sure that we remove some of that hydrocarbonate ions, and so they will get pumped out into the plasma. And there, in the fluid, the watery fluid around the blood cells, the red blood cells, we can actually hold a large amount of carbon dioxide here as hydrocarbonate ions. So carbon dioxide will basically change to hydrocarbonate ions, and then it will be transported into the blood plasma for storage, or basically for transporting around the body. And so we get to the lungs, and there the lungs will allow the reverse of all of these processes, basically, because as we decrease the concentration of carbon dioxide near the lungs and increase the concentration of oxygen, all of these processes can then be reversed, and they will just move out of the blood into the lung tissue, and then eventually out when you breathe out. Okay, so here we have some tissue that's going through respiration, so maybe very active tissue, and here they have the mitochondria inside here, and so the mitochondria are going to be releasing lots of CO2, and that CO2 is going to dissolve into the blood. So it will just diffuse basically from the tissue right directly into the blood and then eventually gets picked up by the red blood cells. And so about 75% of this CO2 that's coming into the red blood cells, it's basically going to combine with the hemoglobin to create what we call carbaminohemoglobin. And carbaminohemoglobin's formation is really dependent on partial pressure. So when partial pressure of CO2 is really, really high, we see carbohemoglobin forming. When we start moving towards the lungs, there will be less partial pressure of carbohemoglobin, or partial pressure of CO2. When we breathe in, there will be a lot of oxygen present instead of CO2 present. And so that high partial pressure of oxygen and low partial pressure of CO2 in the lungs will reverse this process. So the carbohemoglobin can kind of form naturally on its own, and then we can reverse everything once we get to the lungs, and the partial pressure of oxygen versus CO2 reverses this. Now what else can happen is that we can get the formation of H2CO3, which is carbonic acid. And so carbonic acid basically is when water mixes with carbon dioxide together to make a weak acid. Now, this process of water combining with CO2 to create carbonic acid is a natural process. It can happen by itself, but to regulate the amounts of carbonic acid and the amount of carbonic ions present in the cell, there's actually going to be another enzyme present called carbonic anhydrase. And an anhydrase basically means that it will remove one let me get some color, remove one hydrogen. So anhydrase means to remove a hydrogen. So carbonic anhydrase will cut away one of the hydrogens, which creates HCO3 plus. So it's negative, sorry, because it's lost hydrogen ion. So it ends up creating, let me just write it here. It creates HCO3 negative plus hydrogen plus. And we'll actually look at this in the next slide. But so this enzyme is basically there to help regulate the effects of the acid. We can't just allow the carbonic acid to build up in the blood and build up in the red blood cells, because it eventually will start to affect the structure of proteins by making things more acidic. So we have this carboxylic anhydrase kind of helping to regulate this. And we'll look at that on the next slide. Okay, so then to kind of help review, and then we need to give you some more information basically on what happens when we form that carbonic acid. But just to review, so this is kind of overviewing everything that we've looked at so far. So the first one obviously is that we are seeing carbon dioxide from the cells doing lots of respiratory activity. It's diffusing out of that tissue into the blood and eventually goes directly into the red blood cell here, where it enters the red blood cell at 2. Then we will have the formation of carbaminohemoglobin, where some of the hemoglobin that has released the oxygen will bind to the carbon dioxide in order to help move the carbon dioxide in the blood that way. But a good amount of it, as we said, 75%, is going to mix with water to create the carbonic ions and the carbonic acid, basically. Now the problem, and give you a little bit of chemistry of this, is this guy here, CO3. This structure can very easily lose a hydrogen. All right. In terms of chemistry, the loss of a hydrogen from this compound is actually really, really simple. It can constantly be happening. It can reform, and it can break away. And so it's kind of cycling through this structure. Just like the idea when we talk about water, water is actually going back and forth between this, right, our ions, and stable H2O, and they're just kind of going back and forth in balance, right? So if we have a buildup of H2CO3, there is an increased probability that we get a whole bunch more of these hydrogen ions floating around in our blood, and that's not good, because that's going to severely affect pH. And so that's where that anhydrase, carboxylic anhydrase, is going to come in. So it is going to remove a hydrogen. All right, and so as this carbonic anhydrase will remove a hydrogen, which will create our HCO3 negative, right, and our H plus. So we'll do it automatically, but rather than letting the hydrogen ion float around in the red blood cell, it gets picked up by a hemoglobin. So hemoglobin can also grab onto these hydrogen ions. So that kind of acts as a buffer. It kind of helps regulate changes in the pH. By not letting too many hydrogen ions just start floating around in our body, we grab them with any excess hemoglobins that aren't being used. Then we also have this transport protein, okay, and that transport protein is going to take the hydrogen ions, and it's going to, or the HCO3 ions, and it's going to kick them out using a transport protein. Okay, and so that ends up inside of the blood plasma. And so once in the blood plasma, the HCO3 minus, that's a much larger volume or an area for it to be dissolved into. And so there's a lot of, the CO2 can be just carried around in that blood plasma, and it won't really have a strong negative effect. However, if we keep pushing out these negative charges, right? We see that this is negatively charged here. Oh, hold on. Highlight it. Can't really highlight it. I'm using the wrong thing. One second. There we go. This is negatively charged, right? And so if we keep pushing out more negative charges out of the cell, that's going to cause a problem for the internal parts of the cell. It will start to become more positively charged. So rather, to help balance out these charges, when an HCO3 is released, a chloride ion, which is negatively charged, will get pulled into the red blood cell. And so that's also one of the other reasons why you need chlorine in your diet. You need salts, basically, in your diet, like, you know, table salts and other various types of salts you get from your food. You also need to make sure that your ion levels are relatively balanced, because here's an example of where you've got chlorine balancing out the charges in your red blood cells as it's basically dealing with this abundant amount of hydrogen ions so that it prevents your blood from becoming super acidic. Okay, so hopefully that helps make a little bit more sense. And so they're just restating it here. Basically, the hydrogen carbonate can diffuse out through a carrier, right? So this guy here, this guy can leave through this carrier protein, and some chlorine will come in order to help kind of balance everything out. And the extra hydrogen ion, that's going to be picked up by our hemoglobin here. All right, and so that acts as a buffer, so that helps prevent the blood's pH from changing too much. There's also some blood plasma proteins that are released by the liver. So one of the things that they can do with some of the ones we learned about with transport as well, they can also help act as buffers to help prevent the pH of the blood from shifting in one direction, too much in one direction or the other. And then we have here what we call a chloride shift, or the idea that these chlorine ions are coming in to the cell in order to make sure that the cell doesn't become too positively charged by losing all these negatively charged HCO3s. So we have to make sure we have a nice balance of charges across the membrane. All right, so hopefully this makes some sense. You do need to know the 3 different ways in which carbon dioxide is moving around the body, and you need to, understand how it's regulated, what pH has to do with it, what charges have to do with it, and then of course all the key vocabulary words. So make sure you do learn this information. So just to reiterate all this whole thing is basically caused by an abundance of CO2 in the tissue and a lack of oxygen. And so as oxygen is diffusing passively from the blood into the tissue, CO2 is diffusing passively from the tissue into the blood, and then we have all of this. And so you have to be able to understand everything that's been going on in that image and what that would mean. So if you can explain or understand all of that, you should be in good shape. So as we just stated with the transferring of CO2, as CO2 is being dealt with in the red blood cells with the carbonate ions and the hemoglobin and hemoglobin picking up the other hydrogen ions that get released, this will have an effect on pH, but the buffer system severely limits the effect of the pH shift, but there is an effect on pH. And because CO2 will have an effect on the pH of your blood, that is where we get the Bohr effect. And the Bohr effect is just this fantastic way of your body being able to regulate where oxygen is being released to areas that need it, purely based on the presence of CO2, which has caused the pH to shift. And so when we talk about Bohr effect, or the Bohr shift, is what they say. Bohr effect is fine as well. Basically, it's how pH causes oxygen to dissociate from hemoglobin. So it would say that this is our regular blood here. And let me use orange. right? So this is our regular blood line, so regular hemoglobin. So we will have a shift towards the right when we have a very active area of our body. And so if we're having a very active sections of your body, there will be this shift here, all right? And this is going to cause the hemoglobin basically to become less saturated because of this shift in pH. And so basically what happens is that as you do more respiration, so you're, for example, in your muscles, you're doing a bunch of activity, right? You do a whole bunch more respiration, and so then you start producing more CO2. And so as we said earlier, the CO2 is going to dissolve into your blood, and then as it's dissolving into your blood, it's going to start to lower the blood's pH. And so it's a very small lowering. Here you can see a pH of 7.6 versus we start to see this effect, let's see, at a pH of 7.2. So it's not that huge of a shift. And the reason why the change in pH is so small is because of what we just talked about with how we are holding onto the CO2, preventing it from becoming too acidic or changing the blood too quickly from basic to acidic, right? So we have a, well, not really basic to acidic, but more acidic. So we have a change from 7.6 to 7.2. But when this happens, when we see this shift, pH has an effect on hemoglobin's ability to hold on to oxygen. So here if we say 50% saturated, right? There's our 50% line. If we use regular blood, right? Regular blood is probably going to have, it's hard to draw lines, sorry. Let's say that's about 25, or somewhere between 25 and 30 pressure, kilopascals in terms of oxygen, in order to be about 50%. Because we've shifted to the right because of this drop in pH, because we're having a lot more CO2 being released from our active cells, now our 50% saturation point is more like 40 pascals. And so that means that we need a higher concentration of oxygen in order to keep hemoglobin saturated. And so that means that if CO2 starts to increase in concentration in that part of the blood or that area of the body, hemoglobin becomes less efficient at holding onto the oxygen, which makes a lot of sense. Because if there's a lot of CO2 being released into the blood, it's probably because we've been doing lots of respiration. If we've been doing lots of respiration, that means we're probably needing to replenish the amount of oxygen. We need a lot of oxygen in that area. So by pH causing, or shift in pH caused by the amount of CO2, causing hemoglobin to hold on to oxygen poorly, the oxygen is more likely to be released in the tissue that's doing a bunch of the activity that's releasing all the CO2. And so we don't necessarily have to measure the amount of oxygen that's around in the blood and worry about releasing oxygen to the parts of the body because of the concentration of oxygen. All we have to do is, as oxygen is moving around the body, once a part of your body starts to become really, really active, either through exercise or digestion, or you're just thinking really, really hard, like you are right now about all this complex material, that increased use of energy triggers more respiration, which triggers more CO2 to be released, which lowers the pH. And by lowering the pH, the hemoglobin just naturally starts releasing more oxygen to that same area. So the CO2 is going to increase, which drops the pH, and therefore it's more likely for CO2 to dissociate from the hemoglobin and then get into the tissue. So in the lungs, there will be reverse of this, because there's a higher level of oxygen partial pressure and a lower level of CO2. We will start to see CO2 levels will drop, and so we will shift in the other direction. We actually don't show it here, but there can be a shift in the other direction towards the left in the lungs, and so that shift will cause CO2 to quickly dissociate from the hemoglobin. So remember, hemoglobin's holding on to a good amount of CO2 in our blood. And so the CO2 will quickly be released from the hemoglobin, and oxygen will come in and take its place. And so in the lungs, we will shift in one direction in order to help increase the probability of oxygen getting into your hemoglobin. And then when we're in tissue that's very, very active, there is a pH shift in the other direction, which causes an increase of the releasing of oxygen in that tissue, because it's probably an area that needs it. And so it's basically it's this Bohr shift, is this regulation of whether or not we are making it easier or harder for oxygen to stick to hemoglobin, just based on the pH of the blood itself at that time. So we've talked about how oxygen is going to be moving around the body, and we talked about how CO2 is going to move around the body, and we talked about this connection between oxygen and CO2 and how good hemoglobin is at doing its job based on pH. So now we need to talk about how are you going to regulate your blood's pH? How does your body keep all of this in regular homeostatic levels? So you should remember the concept of homeostasis, right? And the idea that you need to maintain a very specific point or level point in your body, because that's really what's best for how your body's been adapted. We have a homeostatic point of 37 degrees Celsius, and our enzymes function best at 37 degrees Celsius, so we're trying to maintain that body temperature. Same thing with the amount of glucose that's in your blood, the amount of oxygen that's in your body, and the amount of CO2 that's in your body, because that all is going to lead to the amount of your pH, pH of your blood. And so your blood is going to be monitored by very specific chemoreceptor cells. And so chemoreceptor cells, so they are specifically monitoring the amount, or watching the amount of certain chemicals present in your blood. So as the blood moves through parts of your aorta and your carotid, which is kind of in your neck, on the sides of your neck, they're going to kind of measure basically the amounts of hydrogen ions that might be present in the blood, or the amount of carboxylic acid, or carbonate ions that are floating around in your blood. And so then they're going to help regulate the amount of CO2 present in the blood, and limit in response to primary changes in the amount of CO2. So if there's an increase in the amount of CO2 suddenly in the concentration of your blood, if there's an increase in the amount of hydrogen ions, we would see a shift in the blood. The blood would basically become more acidic. And so these chemoreceptors are going to detect your blood, whether or not it is more basic or more acidic than what it should be. And when they get activated, they will send an impulse along some nerves to your hypothalamus, which is what regulates a lot of things in your body. And your hypothalamus will then send out a response to help you deal with the fact that your blood has suddenly become more acidic. And so we'll talk about that in the next slide. So as these chemoreceptors are monitoring basically the pH of your blood, the homeostatic point that they're trying to regulate is typically about 7.35 to 7.45. It's a very, very narrow range, and that's why a shift in a certain amount of exercise, for example, makes your blood slightly more acidic, and it causes just a series of things to happen that will make your body change the way that you're breathing, so that you try to get rid of as much carbon dioxide as possible. So you could have acidosis, which basically means that your blood has become too acidic if it drops below 7.35. Interesting little piece of information you might not have heard, but if you actually get down to 7.0, actually neutral blood, like water level neutral, you die. That's so acidic that your body actually can't take it anymore, and parts of your brain will start to not function well, and you die. And so it's scary thinking about you're doing exercise, you're actually getting really, really close to death, if it wasn't for the fact, you're breathing out CO2 really quickly to help regulate your blood pH. You can actually have alkalosis, which would be if it's too basic. It can happen depending on diet, or possibly if you're having difficulty regulating things in other parts of your body, like your kidneys. So anyway, if your blood becomes too acidic, if you have acidosis, you have a very quick response, because, as I said, if you get too acidic, you will die quickly. So you really want to respond quickly if your blood starts to become too acidic. So naturally, you already have in your circulatory system a bunch of buffers. So you have hemoglobin there to help kind of regulate the hydrogen ions that are being released from the carbonic acids. You have blood plasma, the buffers released by the liver, and so there could be an increase in the amount of blood plasma buffers that are present, or hemoglobin will start to have a stronger effect as the environment becomes more and more acidic, hemoglobin's ability to grab onto CO2 and its releasing of oxygen will increase, so that it's helping to regulate even more the blood pH by holding onto more CO2 and hold on to more of these hydrogen ions. And then, of course, the respiratory system is going to react. There will be impulses sent from the hypothalamus down to your lung tissue, and this will encourage you to stay taking deeper, longer, faster breaths. And so this increased breathing rate should dramatically increase the amount of CO2 that you're releasing from your body, which should would stop the lowering of the pH and would help to raise the pH back to normal, because you're getting rid of that CO2 that's basically creating the blood to become more acidic. So as I said before, when you're doing a bunch of exercise, the reason why you're breathing faster is more in the idea that you're trying to stop your blood from becoming so acidic that it kills you. So you're trying to get rid of the CO2 more than you're trying to get the oxygen in order to keep your cells functioning by doing cellular respiration. You do need that oxygen, but it's actually the CO2 which is more dangerous than the low levels of oxygen. If you actually did have alkalosis, if you had too basic of blood, the response isn't as immediate because it's not as dangerous. I don't know what how basic your blood can be, and you could die. Obviously, if you were too basic, you could die from it. But it's not as crazy as a range. It's not as dangerous. So the response isn't as quick. Typically, your kidneys will kick in at this point. And so we didn't really talk about it that much, but you remember the convoluted distal tubule, the CDT, right? You had the PCT and you have the CDT. DCT, distal convoluted tubule, that's the name. So the distal convoluted tubule is actually responsible for this. It can it will change the secretion or absorption of hydrogen ions into your blood. So if we need to get rid of hydrogen ions to make it more basic, the kidneys can also help a little bit if you have acidosis. But if your blood is too basic, it will help release more hydrogen ions. So it will help dump those hydrogen ions. Not release. I can't speak. Sorry. If you have alkalosis, it will help absorb those hydrogen ions into your blood. So you would have lost them during ultrafiltration, and you'll absorb more of them back into the blood, which will help lower the pH a little bit back to what it used to be. So this is a relatively slow response. It will take a couple of days, but eventually the reabsorbing of these hydrogen ions back into the blood will help to bring the pH back into its normal range. And so these are the responses that your hypothalamus can trigger if your blood pH is off, and your chemo receptors in your arteries, those are the ones monitoring this and keeping track of it for you. So here to just kind of graphically monitor everything that's going to happen. So again, the chemo receptors, they're going to be monitoring what happens in your blood. So if there's relatively high levels of CO2, that would of course cause the pH to go down. That's going to be picked up the chemo receptors, which send information to the medulla oblongata up here. And so the medulla oblongata is in the hypothalamus is going to regulate your blood pH. So it's going to send signals down to your respiratory tract. So you've got your intercostal muscles, which are the muscles between your ribs. And we also have your diaphragm, which is the huge muscle that is underneath your lungs, which kind of seals your respiratory chamber. That's the muscle you're supposed to use when you're breathing and singing and you want to have nice sustained even notes. So it's going to cause these muscles to increase your breathing rate. So they will have faster, stronger contractions, and so that would increase the amount of gas exchange. So eventually, when the blood pH goes back to normal, so those chemoreceptors that we have in the blood and the arteries, they're going to see that the amount of oxygen is pretty high, the amount of CO2 is lower, the pH is back at normal, and so it will send signals to the hypothalamus, which will get the medulla oblongata to stop, basically, and so the breathing rate will return back to normal. And so we see a nice little negative feedback system here, regulating the breathing rates so that we can regulate our pH levels. So a nice little practice here would be to discuss why do changes in ventilation occur during exercises. So let's say you have here seven possible marks. Let's say this might be like a 3 or 4 mark question on a test, right? And you'd have to explain how ventilation, or why there's a shift in ventilation due to exercise. So I want you to pause this, and you can give it a shot, see if you can write out what you would say as an answer. And you unpause it, and then we'll go through it. So you paused it? Yeah, you actually tried to do this? Good. Right, so you would want to say first off that if we have during exercise, we'd have an increase in the amount of CO2 concentration in the blood. The increase in CO2 would result in a lowering of the blood pH, or making it more acidic. Chemoreceptors in the carotid artery or the aortic artery are going to detect that there would be a lower pH, which sends an impulse to the respiratory center in the hypothalamus, or you could say specifically the medulla oblongata. So then an impulse is sent down to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, which will cause an increase in ventilation rate. So with the increase in ventilation volume. And so then if we have an increase in ventilation rate and volume, it will remove the excessive CO2 from the blood until the blood pH returns to normal. And so we have a nice little negative feedback system. All right, so I hope you did fairly well with that. Okay, so with the content we've already talked about. We talked about the movement of oxygen in the body. We've talked about the movement of carbon dioxide in the body. We've talked about the effects of carbon dioxide on pH, the effects of pH on hemoglobin and ability to do its job, the effect of pH on respiratory rate. So the last things we're going to talk about is how do respiratory diseases, or what are the different types of respiratory diseases that could occur, or just maybe just general effects on our gas exchange system. So obviously, altitude can have a huge effect on gas exchange because your ability to hold on to oxygen to saturate your hemoglobin is entirely based on partial pressure. So at sea level, just breathing in regular amounts of air around you when you just take a regular breath, that's enough partial pressure. Remember we saw the initial charts were about 14, right? So you can get up to 13, 14 partial pressures of oxygen, which is enough to saturate your hemoglobin to almost 95 to 98%. But if you go higher up in altitude, if you go to the top of a relatively tall mountain, the air is thinner there because there is less pressure on the atmosphere. The molecules spread out a little bit more, and so there are actually less gas molecules per cubic meter than there are at sea level, where the pressure is a little bit higher. So that means that when you breathe in, you are breathing in less oxygen molecules, which means you have a lower partial pressure of oxygen inside your lungs. If you have a lower partial pressure inside your lungs, you're not getting as much oxygen into your hemoglobin, and so then your hemoglobin isn't transferring as much oxygen around your body. So thinner air, basically at higher altitudes, will reduce the amount of partial pressure of oxygen, which reduces how much you can normally breathe in. All right, if you can't reach a regular amount or near 100% saturation of your hemoglobin, you start to suffer what we call hypoxia, or the idea that you are not getting enough oxygen moving through your body. Okay, so your body will try to compensate with this. It will increase your heart rate and your breathing rate, because partially is because it thinks, okay, if we start breathing faster, if we start moving this material faster, we can try to get more oxygen in. But also there's a little bit of a freak out that happens where your body starts to, it's not getting enough oxygen, so you start kind of gasping, trying to get as much oxygen as possible. Plus, if you're not getting enough oxygen into your hemoglobin, your ability to remove or replace or hold on to CO2 can also be affected, which can affect your blood pH, which can trigger higher breathing rates as well. So if this happens to you, normally you start on with headaches, then you can start to feel nausea or vomiting. If you're ever climbing a mountain and you go through what we call hypoxia or altitude sickness, if you start to feel these things, you have to stop, because it will not get better the further you climb up the mountain. It will get worse. So what you have to do is go back down the mountain to a lower altitude where there is a higher concentration of oxygen, and you need to wait there until your body kind of adjusts and starts to feel better and you feel normal again, and then you can start to climb up the mountain again. Do not push yourself, because it will just get so bad, and eventually you can get dizziness and actually loss of consciousness because you're not getting enough oxygen to your brain. You'll get muscle weaknesses, and you'll have super rapid pulse and breathing rate. It will be difficult to focus, and you might have a panic attack if you don't lose consciousness as well. Okay, so as you climb, your body can actually acclimate to higher altitudes by producing more red blood cells and actually more myoglobin, which will help hold on to the blood, the oxygen as it moves through muscle cells. So this higher amounts of mitochondria and myoglobin and red blood cells that can make your circulatory system a little bit more efficient as your ventilation rate starts to increase. However, this takes time. Your body just can't produce red blood cells and myoglobin instantly. So that's when I say you have to be at a comfortable level and you need to rest for a while. It might be an hour or two before your body is ready there for you to start moving on and move up the mountain. If any of you have ever heard of people that climb super high mountains like Mount Everest, they have these base camps. They have camps that they have to climb to, and then they must stay there for a certain number of hours before they're allowed to move forward. And the reason they're staying there is partly because they do need to rest, because it is quite difficult and it's very straining to do it, but because their body also has to adjust. All right, because if they don't adjust, they'll start burning through their oxygen tanks if they keep climbing, and they need those oxygen tanks for later when they're doing the really hard climbing near the top. Okay, and you might find this interesting, but if we look at the evolution of people that live in higher altitudes, like people that live in the Andes Mountains in South America, they typically have genes that are producing larger chests. So they have larger amounts of lung tissue. They have more dense alveoli, or more lung tissue in their lungs. They have more red blood cells, and their hemoglobin has a higher affinity for oxygen. So that is why they can go running around, they can do marathons at extremely high altitudes, where everyone else that's not from that area, that has not been, genetically and over their whole life adapted to that the environment, are basically just dying trying to climb some stairs. So altitude sickness is one of the things that you need to be aware of, what is causing it, and then, of course, if it happens, what would we do in order to try to reverse it? So another disease you need to know about would be emphysema. And so maybe you've heard about emphysema before from people that are live in areas of really high pollution levels, or in companies or jobs where they are exposed to high particulate matter. So basically stuff that's in fumes, that's in smoke, that's thick. So it's not a gas, but like it's actual like particles of matter. Smoking as well causes this, and industrial pollution or air pollution. Anyone who's ever been to hazy cities in Beijing, or in China, like Beijing, you have to worry about breathing this material in. And what happens with emphysema is it's really sad, because you have your normal alveoli here. There's my highlighter here. These are your normal alveoli, and they're all nice and healthy, and they're basically separated into all these little sections so that they can have as much surface area as possible, so they can have rapid diffusion of gases. So CO2 coming in, oxygen coming in, and CO2 going out, right? When you have emphysema, this is what your lung tissue looks like. So the connection, the walls between the different sections of your lungs, your different alveoli, they start to break down and get weak, and eventually they degrade completely, creating sections of lung tissue that are all connected to each other. And that's an issue, because then we lose our surface area, and with lowered surface area, we have less efficient diffusion of gases. Now, this is happening for a couple of reasons. One is that when you breathe in these toxic materials, it can degrade these cells. The cells that make up your alveoli are actually fairly thin, relatively weak, so they can break easily if a bunch of toxic chemicals can land on them and destabilize them. We have breaks that can occur because of coughing, right? You have, if you live in an environment with really polluted air, or you're smoking, you can get really, really bad coughs. And so that pressure that you release when you're like doing it every day over and over again for long periods of time, that pressure wears down the alveoli, and that causes them to burst. And so these connections between them start to degrade, and then we end up with the emphysema issue. But the other one that's really sad is that you're breathing in a bunch of material that doesn't really belong in your lungs. And what does your body do when there's stuff inside you that don't belong? They send the immune system. They send your white blood cells. And so your white blood cells will try to get out of your blood, right? And they'll try to move from your blood into the space here, all right? And when they do that, they have to degrade a little bit of the elastic tissue around the alveoli to move from the blood into the alveoli to help clean the alveoli up. And by all these white blood cells moving through the tissue, they burrow and they make little holes in the tissue itself, which makes it weaker. So your body's own immune system, trying to help you out, trying to keep your lungs clean, is actually ultimately destroying your lung tissue, because they're so active. They're trying their best to like clean up your lungs as much as possible. That they just start to damage the cell because there's just too many things, too many white blood cells moving through your lung tissue, and they're causing these holes. So basically what happens, again, is that we have the air sacs will be damaged, or the alveoli will be damaged. They will start to loosen, weaken, or even rupture in some bad cases. This will cause kind of larger air sacs to occur, and so instead of having many small sacs, it will be like one or two larger ones, which causes a reduction in the amount of surface area, which reduces the efficiency of oxygen moving into the blood and CO2 leaving the blood. So people that have emphysema, eventually they could have something like pneumothorax, which basically is a collapsed lung, which means you lose the ability for your lung really to open and expand when you're breathing, makes breathing extremely difficult. If you have a collapsed lung, you have to get surgery to help fix the damage and kind of reinflate your lung to get it functioning normal. It doesn't happen a lot, but it can happen over prolonged decades of having emphysema. You have heart problems. Because you have less efficient gas exchange between your blood and your lungs, your heart starts pumping harder in order to move the blood quicker to help with this movement of oxygen and CO2 around your body. So your respiratory rate increases, your heart rate increases, and so decades of having like a higher heart rate and higher heart pressure starts to affect your heart's condition and the arteries and themselves. And then we also see that there could be holes that form in your lungs under extreme circumstances. And if you have holes appearing in your lungs, then of course you're going to be losing gases to your tissue in the wrong way. It's not a nice enclosed system. And so you have an exponentially worse problem. So if you have emphysema, there's a couple of things. Are you starting to get if you're starting to get to the signs of emphysema, there are a couple of treatments, things that you can do. So we can have these bronchodilator medications, and basically they're like an inhaler, like if you have asthma, which is actually what we're going to talk about soon anyways. But it's a medication that you can inhale, so it's like an aerosol spray, and you spray it into your mouth as you're breathing, and it will go down into your lungs, and it will help your lung tissue kind of relax a little bit so that it doesn't cough and damage itself as much as it does, and it can kind of help a little bit with less stress on your lung tissue. We can give you steroids, which can help with rapid cellular growth, so maybe help to repair the damaged alveoli before they actually break down. And then we could give you antibiotics to help deal with any of the bacteria and toxins that you're breathing in and help them get removed from your body rather than leave it to your white blood cells, which are trying to burrow through the alveoli wall to get to the infection. So if we can help clean up the infection without using the white blood cells as much, we can actually reduce the effects of them making emphysema worse. So this is just one of those other diseases that you need to understand. You need to know the causes and then ultimately the ways we could treat emphysema. Now, another disease or issue that could be with your respiratory system would be asthma. Asthma is basically when you have an allergic reaction to pollen or dust or skin cells or any other type of toxin that might be floating around in the air. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that actually is dangerous to you, but you have an allergy to it. So that means that your immune system thinks that it's a dangerous thing. And so if you breathe in that dust or, house mites or pollen, your body thinks that it's under attack. And so you have this rapid response where you have inflation of your tissue so that it's easier for the white blood cells to get to that area traveling through the blood. And that's really dangerous because if the muscle tissue around your throat inflates really quickly and gets all swollen, it decreases the space that's there for air to move between your mouth and your lungs. And so if you have an asthma attack, the area here can get swollen and can start to limit your ability to exchange oxygen. So during an asthma attack, the smooth muscle that's along your bronchi will kind of constrict and get engorged with blood and other toxins or other protein signals, not toxins, but protein signals that cause this kind of chain reaction. And it's good in some ways because it is helping your immune system to protect you from something that might hurt you. But unfortunately, in this case, dust probably isn't going to hurt you, and the immune system is overreacting so strongly that we're limiting the exchange of gas, and we know that you need oxygen, right, to stay alive. So what we can do is we can basically use these vasodilators, right? So we could have you, not vasobronchiodilators, not vasobronchiodilators. So basically an asthma spray. And so a bronchiodilator here can be, you breathe in as you push down on the aerosol, and what it will do is it comes in and will bind to the receptor cells in your muscle tissue that's making them all swollen and warm and have this allergic reaction, and it will stop them. It will reverse that reaction essentially and cause your muscle tissue to relax and to be less swollen so that you can have gas exchange, and it basically stops your asthma attack. And of course, we would have to talk about lung cancer. If we're going to talk about diseases and things that show up in the body and things we should be aware of or concerned about, lung cancer is definitely going to be one of those. Lung cancer is a huge issue for numerous people, either because of their jobs, where they live, or because of their habits like smoking. So lung cancer, as you know, just like all the other cancers, is when you have abnormal growth of lung tissue, which can lead to a tumor. A lot of this is going to be caused by smoking or inhaling other carcinogens, those chemicals that cause cancer. One example might be asbestos. Now, asbestos is pretty much banned everywhere in the world from being used as an insulator. However, there are some places that are not up to code, or they might be run-down old buildings that people aren't supposed to be living and working in anyways. But if they are exposed to asbestos, or if they're in a company where asbestos is used as a product or as a way to make a product, you have to worry about breathing it in because it can trigger this abnormal growth because it's a carcinogen, and that can lead to cancer. And of course, we have radioactive radiation, or sorry, radioactive materials, right? Things that give off radiation. Those all could lead to increased number of mutations, and that of course leads to cancer as well. If you have a tumor in your lung, there's a couple things that can happen. First off, even though you're increased the number of cells, they're not functioning cells. They're just tumor cells. So you actually reduce the surface area for gas exchange because you have this big lump of useless material stuck in your lungs, taking up space and getting in the way. So typically you have reduced surface area for gas exchange. This will increase pressure in your blood vessels, and eventually could prevent transport of materials in general between your lungs and certain parts of your blood system. So your gas exchange is going to be less efficient. That's going to affect your circulatory system. And then we can have damage to the pleural membrane, which is kind of around your lungs. That's there to kind of protect it. Your diaphragm, your intercostal muscles, all that material could get damaged as well, which limits your ability to breathe, right? So big problem. So obviously, if you have lung cancer, the treatments are limited depending on the situation. You can use chemotherapy or radiation therapy depending on the size of it. Most often what we're going to do is a leucotomy, where we basically remove a section of the lung that's been affected. Sometimes we might even have to remove the entire lung. You actually can survive with half of a lung, even though it's not a really great life, because you get tired very easily because you have half the amount of gas exchange. You can do it if necessary. So you have a lobectomy, removing sections or even all of the lung, or maybe just removing the cancer tumor itself. It really depends on the situation. Okay, so this has been D.6, which getting into the specifics of our respiratory system. And if you have any questions about anything, please let me know. I'm sorry, I completely forgot. There's still one more thing we need to talk about, which is identifying sections of lung tissue. So no, you're not done yet. So you're almost done. Here is a website as well. I'll put it up in ManageBack, so you can look at basically partial pressure of oxygen versus CO2, and how that affects saturation of hemoglobin. It's a nice, good way to kind of review and go through gas exchange and kind of summarize a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. Okay, so one more thing to talk about. So in addition to being able to understand all the ways that we're transferring oxygen and carbon dioxide, we're regulating our blood pH, and we have different lung diseases and the Bohr effect, you also have to be able to identify specific sections or cells of a cross-section of lung tissue. And it's pretty easy. There's only really 3 things you need to know. So we have our monocytes, and the monocytes, there are 2 different types. They're the ones that make up the alveoli. So here we have, let me put on my highlighter here. Here's the walls of the alveoli. They are very, very, very thin, the monocytes, so you can see how thin they are. And they're basically flattened epithelial cells, or like the thinnest kind of skin layer cells, and they make up the walls of the alveoli. And so they have a very, very, very thin membrane because they need to have an efficient exchange of gases between the alveoli, which is the open space here. All right, so all here is this open space in the alveoli, between there and the oxygen, or sorry, and the capillaries. So we need to have an efficient movement of material between the alveoli and the capillaries, which are also going to be something you need to know. And so they're basically involved in gas exchange. So those are type 1s. Type 2, they're a little bit different. So every alveoli will have a type 2 present, and they are round secretory cells, and they're basically there for secreting material into the alveoli. And basically, they're producing a nice fluid, all right, a watery fluid, kind of a saline solution from them. Let's do it in, no, hold on. Sorry, I want to highlight it in blue, right? Okay, they're secreting it. Why is it purple? No, do blue. There we go. So they're secreting a kind of a watery solution that will go around the edges of the alveoli. And that's important because we actually don't want these cells to stick to each other when we're going through rapid respiratory rate. So we have increased breathing and gas exchange. These cells can actually, in the alveoli, can get very, very close to each other when you're breathing all the way out. You're compressing them as much as possible to breathe out those gases. And so they might actually stick to each other if it wasn't for the monocytes here, the type 2s, releasing kind of a slippery, watery solution that will prevent them from kind of rubbing against each other, causing damage to each other, or sticking to each other when we're going through respiration. We're breathing really hard. And then stuck between all of them are going to be the capillary cells that make up our circulatory system. And so they have their circulatory, the walls are all surrounded as much as possible around the type 1 cells because they're also going to be involved in gas exchange as well. And so between these layers, if you were given a diagram like this, or if you were given a microscope slide, you'd have to be able to identify them and understand what it is that you're looking at and label them. So we can kind of practice that real quick. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can identify what it is, these different types of cells, what it is that we're looking at. All the cells that we've talked about, plus red blood cells, are present here. So see if you can identify them. So pause the video. All right, you paused it, you tried it. All right, so then let's go over this, right? So maybe we could add a little bit of more color right here, and makes it a little bit more obvious. Obviously here, done in red, we have our red blood cells. The red blood cells are quite big in the capillary. Remember, the capillary, which is here, this blue one I'm doing around in blue. Capillaries are just big enough for one red blood cells to move basically one cell at a time through an area. So if you ever see a container with like what looks like an entire cell taking up that space, that's a good chance you're looking at a capillary, and then that other cell inside that space is our red blood cell. Okay, so then we have the epithelial walls of the capillary cells. So a capillary cell is basically 1 cell thick. So the, I do here in red. So this is our plasma membrane. And then here in the black, that's all of the cell parts. That's the, oh, no, I'll do it in black there. That's the nucleus and the mitochondria and all the other parts of the cell that are necessary. That's going to be there stuck to the side, kind of holding up and they're regulating the rest of the capillary wall. Then we have around there, for an efficient gas exchange, we have the type 1s, okay, making up the surface area around the capillary because we need as much gas exchange. And then the type 2 are going to be stuck there around them, and they're going to be releasing the kind of watery solution around this space in order to make sure that they are that nothing kind of sticks to each other if we kind of compress it and breathe out. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too difficult for you. And if you have any questions, now this is the actual end of D6. All right.